Dear me. Okay, so I'm Nicholas, and 5 years ago, I started to use Python. Before that, I'd been a .NET developer, and I managed to escape into the Python community at last. And I was obviously an experienced developer, but I wanted to learn about Python, and I'd heard that this being an open source free software project, that the community was good. So I wanted to join this community and take part in these community events and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, in London at the time, I live just north of London, there was nothing happening for Python people. So I met with a bunch of people in a pub, the usual sort of user group type thing. And we sat down and we had a few beers together and we started talking about, well, what sort of things could we do as a community in London? Because London's a huge place, it's got lots of developers. What could we do? Well, a guy called Jonathan Hartley, I don't know if any of you know him, talked about the Code Dojo, which is obviously what this talk is about, and what we've managed to do to the Code Dojo format in London. And so we thought, well, this sounds like a good idea, we'll start. And so we picked a date in September, so it was as if it were the beginning of the school year. That's the beginning of September in the UK. And we announced it, and we had about 30 people turn up. So this talk is about, it's the story, it's not a technical talk, it's the story of what we've done in the London Dojo, how we've changed the dojo format, and how that's affected the Python community in and around London. And maybe, I hope, give you ideas for perhaps things that you could do when you go to your user groups back in Krakow or Warsaw or wherever you've come from. And finally, this evening at 8 o'clock, we're going to be running a dojo here at PyCon Poland, the very first dojo ever in Poland. So I hope you come along and we'll see what sort of a mess we can make. So what is a dojo? So I'll give you a little bit of history here. It was invented in Paris about 10, 15 years ago by some French guys who obviously wanted to improve their skills as software developers. So their assumption was, as you can see up here, I'll read it out quickly. I generally don't like playing karaoke with my slides, but I'll do it for this one. Acquiring coding skills should be a continuous process. And they had an assumption that a good developer is always going to be learning and reevaluating in order to improve their skills. It's one of the things that I love about being a developer, is the fact that there's always new technology coming along. As you saw with the last talk with packaging, there's yet another packaging type thing with Wheel that we're going to all have to learn to use and things like that. So it's part of the toolkit of a developer is to be able to learn very quickly. And they created this dojo as a space where they could go along and they could practice, deliberately practice. So how does the dojo work? What do you do in a dojo? So we know you go there to practice programming, so what do you do? Well, helpfully, on their Coding Dojo website, they set out a set of rules, guidelines, that you should follow. And they were quite strict about what you should do. I hope you can see that all right. So starting at the top of the Eiffel Tower, if you imagine you threw yourself off the top of the Eiffel Tower, for the first 2 minutes, they're sort of doing, well, for the first part of the talk, for the first part of the evening, they're doing, organization stuff. And then the first red block, at 10 minutes in, they decide on a problem. I'll talk about how they choose, how we choose problems in a minute. A problem to solve that evening. And then for 40 minutes, 40 minutes, a bit like a game of football really, or a game of rugby more accurately, with a half-time break, they do this problem in the form of a kata. I'll explain what a kata is now. So a kata, how many of you do martial arts? So those with your hands up, you know what a kata is. So a kata, very briefly, I used to do karate years ago. A kata is a set of forms, a set of movements that somebody practices so that you get used to doing the kicks and the punches and the blocks and the various different things. And each kata has a name, and each kata has a particular function, so that it's practicing a certain sort of a kick or a movement from one punch to another sort of a kick. And the point is that you're practicing and you're improving your muscle memory. So should you be attacked at night in a in an alleyway, you have the moves already sorted out, and you know how to take someone's head off with your little finger and things like that. So that's what a kata is. Another way of thinking about the kata is that it's like an etude in music. You get bonus points if you can identify the composer. It shouldn't be a surprise, given that we're in Poland, who the composer is. But an etude, a musician, I used to be a musician as well before I was a programmer, and an etude is a piece of music that has been written for the purpose of allowing you to practice a particular sort of technique. So here you've got, okay, I'm not going to explain what that's about because it's just going to take too long, but it's a pianistic sort of thing about voice and having your weakest fingers, your fourth and fifth fingers are actually playing the melody there, and you've got your thumb and second and third fingers are playing the middle part. And the way I play the piano really badly. The thumb and the second finger, it sounds like a herd of elephants trying to play the piano, and the little finger is always too quiet, and this is what this etude is trying to help you do, is balance those things out. So it's a little bit like that. So how do we approach the kata, these things that we want to practice? There are two ways of doing it. There's the prepared kata, where somebody has sat down and thought about what this programming problem is, and they present it to the dojo, and they do it in steps, and each discrete step, they don't move on to the next step until everybody in the room has understood what that step is, and they go, does everybody understand? Yes, we all understand. Right, so the next part of solving this problem is blah, 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 blah. Does everybody understand? Yes, blah, 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 and off you go. So that's the prepared kata, where people sit and they observe somebody, an expert, solving a problem. And the idea is you're sort of getting an insight into how this person solves the problem. So the other sort of kata is a Randori Kata. And Randori means chaos taking, which basically means freestyle, which means it's not been pre-organized. And basically, as it says up there, the bullet points, I'm not going to read them out. I'm just going to talk a little bit over them. I'll let you read them as I'm talking. It's public pair programming. And you have a pilot at the keyboard, and they are solving... we did it in London, is there was, you either had 10 minutes or a passing unit test. And as the pilot, you wrote your unit test and you made it pass. If you did that within 10 minutes, that's great. And this was done in front of everybody. And the pilot, after they'd succeeded at that task, they would go back into the audience, and their co-pilot would sit and become the new pilot, and there would be a volunteer from the audience would come up and become the new co-pilot. Now, the important part about this, I seem to remember that the Parisian guys who invented the dojo format sort of emphasized this a lot, is that you shouldn't interrupt the pilot because he's actually thinking, he or she is thinking very hard, trying to solve this problem, etc. Actually, only the co-pilot is allowed to do that, okay? And everybody else, it has to be very quiet, and it's all very Zen-like study type situation going on here. And the other thing that I wanted to say that we tried to do in London was, well, I'll try and tell it as a story. When I was learning to drive the car, my driving instructor would say things like, okay, I want you to tell me what you're thinking about as you're driving this car. So I would say things like, okay, I can see there's somebody waiting at the zebra crossing over there, so I'm going to look in my mirror, I'm going to apply the brakes, and I can see they're crossing now, so I'm just going to stop. Okay, they've started, I'm going to put the car back into gear, I'm looking over my shoulder to make sure there's nobody passing me, etc., etc. So I'm giving a sort of a train of thought so that my driving instructor knows that he's not going to die anytime soon, but also that I'm thinking about the right sort of things. And it means that this instructor can give me feedback because I'm not thinking about the right sort of things when I'm looking at the big poster on the wall or something like that, okay? So we encourage people to do a similar sort of thing with programming, so that they might sit down, and if you have an expert Python programmer, they will go about solving a problem or trying to get this unit test to pass in a particular sort of a way that's interesting. And you don't, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but it's not very often that you get to see or hear the train of thought behind somebody who's an expert, how they go about solving this problem. So this is a really useful thing. The other side of the coin is that if you've got a newbie Python programmer there, you know, I've obviously used Python for 5 years, and I feel like I know my way around the language, and I assume a lot when I'm talking to other people. So when you see a newbie programmer trying to approach a problem, and you realize, well, you know what? they don't know about X or Y or Z, or if only they knew they had to import this thing, they could use that to solve their problem. And it's a way of being able to give feedback to people so that they can improve. So here's the first photo from the London Dojo. There are going to be lots. So we have Michael Ford, who's the unit test maintainer in core Python. He's the pilot. John Ribbons is co-pilot, and Tim, who's another Python core developer, is going to be happy to volunteer in 5 minutes once Michael, ironically, has made his unit tests pass. So that's the theory. That's the theory about how a dojo is supposed to work. But what actually happened in London? Well, we didn't really know what we were doing, and we didn't stick to the rules, and we made rather a number of mistakes because we were making this up as we were going along. So the first mistake we did is that, if you remember at the very beginning, I said we wanted to try and do something in London that was community-oriented. So we thought, well, wouldn't it be good to get people to know each other? They can sort of have a bit of a pizza and some beer. That was probably the mistake. And get to know each other. Second mistake, we had loads of people turn up. Can't possibly have that. We only had a very small office as well. That's probably the extent of Fry IT's office. People were sat on tables and everything like that. And we also tried to shut the audience up, which really I don't feel was a very good idea, because there was quite a lot of stuff that wasn't supposed to happen. For example, when we noticed that somebody had actually managed to get their test to pass, there was a round of applause and a cheer, which wasn't supposed to happen. You're supposed to be quiet and concentrating, aren't you? Audience participation. What's going on here? Said Michael Ford from the back row. You don't want to do it like that. You want to do it like this. Have you seen? I did this thing a couple of months ago with the mock module, which will allow you to do blah, blah, blah. And off he was. He went away. Okay? You're not supposed to do that. It's only supposed to be the co-pilot who's interrupting the pilot. Lots of discussion and debate, because not only had Michael opened his mouth, but then Tim Golden, who you saw in the previous slide, said, no. They could do it this other way, actually. If you remember, this is a newbie here we've got. They should probably think about it in this way. So we started to have a really interesting debate. Nothing going on at the front, which is where it was all supposed to be happening. This was a debate within the crowd, within you lot, as it were. And I ended up, because I was the first one sort of being the MC for this evening, it was like classroom control at a really badly behaved school, you know? And generally it was quite a noisy time. People were interrupting and things like that. And, you know, it wasn't all lots of mistakes. Actually, when we were in the pub afterwards, we thought it was a really good thing that happened. We tried to stick to the rules, but you know what? We didn't. So, like good free software hackers, we forked the dojo concept and we adapted it to our own purposes. So, one of the first adoptions that we had was Dave, who had a great idea. He wanted to give a presentation and get feedback. And he didn't want to just do a presentation like I'm doing, like I'm talking at you and you're sort of looking at me or checking your mobile phones or trying to get on the internet or something like that. He wanted it to be more toing and froing, more like a seminar, actually. And then Kieran had a great idea. Kieran was doing a PhD at Imperial in something or other to do with lasers, he tells me. But Kieran would come along and he'd be really up for doing some coding, because that's the only way you're going to learn, is by learning by doing some Python coding. But if you think about it, it takes about 10, 15 minutes for this sequence, this cycle of a pilot starting, getting the test to pass, blah, 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 getting somebody to volunteer, getting them out of the audience, putting the pilot back in the audience, blah, 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 blah. And so after 2 hours, you've not had that many people actually on the keyboard coding. In fact, only a handful. And Kieran, he wanted to code, and he was never fast enough to put his hand up and go, I'll go. Okay? So he wanted to find a way to allow people to code together. So why don't we all code in groups on the same task? So suddenly we have 2 new Code Dojo formats that we'd spontaneously invented. So show and tell, which was Dave's idea. So here we have Rene, who is a Pygame core developer, and he did a fantastic show and tell. In fact, it was the first one. I'll come on to my contribution to that evening in a minute. But Rene brought along everything but the kitchen sink and plugged it into his laptop. And he was showing us how you could use a keyboard to control, a musical keyboard, I mean, to control a game, turn it into a gamepad, get MIDI from it, play things out through it. Rene also does web development, and the way he deploys, he has a pedal on the floor that is connected to a laptop that is running Pygame in a loop that's waiting for an event. The event is when he taps his foot on the pedal. That sends a signal to his deployment scripts to kick off, and it pulls his code down and does whatever it needs to do to deploy his website. So I just hope he doesn't really get into his music and keeps tapping his foot at the wrong time. Yes, perhaps that's how they do it. So I'm going to show you a little. Okay, here we go. So I might need a little bit of help here with the holding of microphone and things. So I told you a little bit about the show and tell. So the theme of the evening that evening was Pygame, and what we wanted to do was try and do a prepared kata as well. Now. I told you that prepared katas were supposed to be given by an expert. So Rene, being a core developer, was the obvious choice for this. But Rene actually said, well, I think it would be good if we had a complete beginner try and pick up Pygame over the next month and produce something for it, because that would help me, because then I would find out if it's an easy project to get into. So I got volunteered to do that. And it was December's dojo, so I thought, I'm going to create a Christmas card in Pygame. So what I did is I split up my development into various discrete steps. So here we have, oh God, you can't see any of it, can you? Okay, so this is a very simple Pygame app, and all it does is it displays a window, 800 by 600, and a rather Christmassy, wintry sort of a scene. And what I would do is I would start adding to it. So between step 1 and step 2, I could do a diff and discuss the diff with the people in the dojo so they can see, actually, what I'm doing here is I'm drawing a greeting onto my Christmas card. So let's have a look at that. So if I check out step 2 and do Xmas again, there we are, Merry Christmas, etc., etc. And there were 7 steps, and each step made the Christmas card a little bit more complicated. And I attempted to introduce a new concept from Pygame at each step. So if I, step 7, I think the last one. So this had music, animation, and all sorts. I'm just going to hold this near my microphone so you can hear the really cheesy music. So, appalling bad. This is really terrible. But what we have is, I've managed to introduce the basic concept. I've managed to introduce the basic concept of Pygame here. I've got keyboard events, so I switched off the snow. I can switch the snow back on again. Okay, I can get rid of that disgusting music as well. And if I press Q, our friendly little Frosty the Snowman, he goes away. Where were we? So, by the end of this took me about, 40 minutes to talk my way through this code, and it was very useful for me because I had to prepare quite hard. Luckily, any really technical questions went in Rene's direction, but after the presentation, the assembled dojo were able to take my code and start to do really fun things with it. So, for example, we had one guy, in about half an hour, he managed to get the code to work so that if you press the spacebar, flames appeared from the bottom of the snowman. He went up the screen like that and would disappear off the top. Another guy, one of the Google engineers in London, he came along and he, in the GIMP, he drew really, really basic kind of hand that you could move from left to right with the arrow keys. And if you press the spacebar, a snowball would appear, and he introduced collision detection here. So if the snowball collided with the snowman, he used the alpha channel in the sprite for the snowman to make a hole in the snowman. So the aim of the game was to try and kill the snowman, which wasn't particularly nice. But anyway, that's a show and tell session. The important thing is that you're supposed to get involved, all right? So Team Dojo is the other style, which I'll talk about at great length in a minute. But you can see here, there's an awful lot going on and lots of people on lots of different keyboards. How many people have been to the London Dojo here? There's a handful, three or four. There's a lot of energy in the room when you do a group dojo because everybody's focused on this one problem. So, show and tell, yeah. It's more like a seminar than a presentation. So people are encouraged to interrupt, ask questions, debate, code along, which is what they were doing with my Pi game thing, and point out problems. And they managed to point out plenty of problems with my code. And participation is expected. So this is, I'm not quite sure what we were doing here, but obviously I'm having a good time. So the Team Dojo. Okay, so a small team programming, teaching and learning in a safe place to fail with sympathy. So that means that it's a safe place for you to go and practice with your buddies. So what do we do? So at the beginning of the evening, while we're having our pizza and our beer, we have a blackboard and we write suggestions for simple programming tasks. Emphasis on the simple here. At the beginning of the coding part of the evening, we vote. We go down each of the ideas that have been suggested. We vote on which one the assembled group of attendees thinks is the most fun or interesting. Then we split up into teams of about 5 each, and we give ourselves about an hour and a quarter to try and solve this problem. That's where it gets noisy and quite energetic. Magic happens. And then at the very end, and this is the best part of the dojo, we have what's called the show and tell, where every team has to come up and you do a public code review. So the first thing you do is show us your code running, if it can run, because often it won't. And secondly, talk us through your code. Now, this is so important because everybody's head is in the same problem space, and everybody has solved this problem in a slightly different way, and sometimes radically different ways. And what's interesting is that one group might have solved this aspect of the problem, and another group might have solved that other aspect of the problem, and together, that might have been quite a good solution that covered all the bases. But, you know, it's good for people to see how people are solving problems and attacking problems as well. So, yeah, so here we are. Here's the famous blackboard. And some of the suggestions here. So the Roman numeral calculator is quite famous. Tic-tac-toe, Pig Latin, Game of Life, that sort of thing. That's the sort of level. So here's 4 of the 5 or 6 teams that we have. You can see lots of people gathered around a keyboard, usually arguing. But the important thing that I want to point out to you, and which we always point out at the beginning of the dojo, is that we accept developers of lots of different levels. So you've seen Python core developers at the dojo, and we have people who are just learning programming come to the dojo as well. And we say, if you're a new programmer, your job is to ask questions, and it doesn't really matter how stupid you think your question is, just ask it anyway, because it's important that you learn from these people, these experienced people, and they will show you the answer. But if you are an experienced Python programmer and somebody asks you a question, it's your responsibility to try and explain what it is that they need the answer for in as simple way as possible. So you are actually learning by teaching these concepts, because somebody might ask you a question about, Peter, so tell me, what is a meta class then? And Peter's going to have to think, well, you know, how am I going to explain this? Now, as we saw this morning, Peter did a fantastic job of that because Peter's thought about this before. But often, if you're a programmer and you have this sprung on you and you start to think about it, it actually changes the way you think about how you code, because for the first time, you're starting to reflect. And there we are, the show and tell at the end with all the bugs and all. So in the dojo, we learn by doing, by practicing together. We fail safely with sympathy, which means it always goes wrong. There's always a group that cocks up, but that's all right. In fact, often that's the most educational part of the evening, because we can see why this group cocked up. We teach one another, like I just said, learning through teaching. And we explain ourselves to our peers, which is important. If you can explain something concisely, you've probably got the concept down yourself. Exploring each other's solutions as well. and building a community, which is very important. Building a community is important, and we didn't have a community in London. Okay, so here we have some people we've managed to bait already. So this is interesting. So the guy who's looking at you with puppy eyes, that's Bruce Derling, who is a closure expert. And he came along to the dojo because we said there was free beer and pizza. But he went away thinking, well, why don't we have a closure dojo? So the closure dojo has been going for about 3 years now. He's very successful as well. And it turns out, although the Python dojo is the first, there are quite a number of dojos happening in London if you look carefully. So I'm going to finish now. I'm going to finish with some personal observations. So we're developers and we like to learn about things, and one of the traps that we can fall into is getting caught out by so-called gurus who offer a solution or offered a methodology that you should follow. You should, if you're going to become a great developer, you should always do test-driven development, or you should always do agile, or Scrum's the thing for you, or whatever. Okay, yeah. You know, people can offer pithy aphorisms to you and little sound bites and things that sound clever and things like that. But to be honest with you, I'm offering you a pithy soundbite here. The best thing that you can do, and this is what I really passionately believe when we're in the dojo, the best thing that you can think is that I don't know anything really. What can I do to learn something this evening? How can I reevaluate the things that I assume I already know about? And when you do that, you learn a lot yourself. So please, if you're in London, come along to the Python Dojo and say hi. You'll always be welcome there. Image credits, blah, 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 blah. Questions, binary beer bottles, there you are. Thank you very much. There's one at the back as well.
Does it work? Yeah. How often do you meet? Is it like once a month or once a year or something?
Sometimes I wish it was once a year. It's once a month. And it's on the first Thursday of every month.
Don't you have a problem? We had a little problem with Krakow community having kind of subjects dry out and people kind of stop coming. And
okay, so we tried to make this the antidote to a user group that started off with loads of people turning up, and then after 3 months and several talks, it just ended up being a handful of people in the pub bitching about PHP or something. I don't know. Which is why we did the dojo format. So we've seen 4 different ways you can run a dojo, and even if you do that, you know, alternate it each time, you've got, you know, quite a lot of material you can use. You've got the prepared kata, you've got the Randori, you know, public pair programming, you've got the show and tell sort of forum type dojo, and then you've got the chaos that is the group-based dojo. And it's amazing how many people come up with new ideas when we have the ideas blackboard. And sometimes you have people who come up with ideas from work. We had somebody who they had a scheduling problem, so we solved that for him.
Thanks.
That's all right. There was a question at the back.
Hi. So the dojo tonight, is there a limit on numbers of people who could come? And how can you register if you need to register?
Okay, so I'm going to regret saying this, but there is no limit on the numbers tonight. Which will mean I'm going to have to be on my toes as the cat herder. That's the name that the London Dojo gives to the person who's emceeing. And there's about 7 or 8 of us who do that. We actually limit it to 30 tickets because any larger than that, it can get quite chaotic, as I'm sure we'll find out later on this evening. And the dojo actually, we announce it on the Python UK mailing list, and the tickets usually sell out between sort of 2 and 4 hours. And then we have a waiting list. There's no pizza tonight, although there will be beer afterwards.
I'm wondering, is this always organized by the same group of people, and don't those people get tired of it? Or, I don't know, they are busy at that time, so on it, or
So-
you know, the usual life.
Yeah. So so I have 3 children, and I do other things as well. And you're quite right. So the question is, how do who organises this? Who's crazy enough to do this? And so, like I said, we have about 7 or 8 cat herders who organise the dojo, and we all know what the passwords are for the Eventbrite thing that we use for people to sign up with. Yeah, so we just take it in turns, really. And people are enthusiastic, and people are joining the cat herders because they can see that it's actually good for them to have to stand up and try and organize this thing. There's a kind of a technique that you need to develop to be able to control a crowd of hungry, half-drunk Python programmers who are trying to write an adventure game or whatever it is that we're doing that evening. So yeah, it's fun being a cat herder. So yeah.
Hi. For the group dojos, what kinds of ideas do you find work well and what don't work so well?
What an excellent question. Okay, so we had, for example, an architect who should have known better, who works at The Guardian, suggest recreate Street Fighter using ASCII art. And because we're a democracy, that got voted on because it sounded cool. It was a disaster, okay? And I'm sure you can figure out why. You've got about an hour and a quarter, and you want to write a game, okay? Algorithmic problems work really well because they can be tightly defined. We know precisely what it is that we are trying to do here. Often people will suggest jokey problems, and because they sound fun, people will choose them. So the cat herders, and we're quite aware of this, the cat herder will use their influence to say, I think this will be a hard problem to solve in an hour and a quarter or something like that. So the way we get around this, as you know, Peter, is that people will look at this, and as people are voting, they'll try and dampen some of the enthusiasm for the more impossible tasks. And we allow people to actually present their ideas for about 30 seconds as we go down the blackboard. And often, reinvent HAL 9000. When we get to that one, the person will go, well, it was only a joke, don't worry about it, and people won't vote for it. So that's another technique that we use to stop the downright silly. There was another question at the back, I believe.
Yes. Do you have any rules when splitting into the groups when you start coding, like by advance or?
Okay, so yes, we use a special patented London Python Code Dojo getting into teams algorithm, and it works like this. So we usually have about 5 teams of 5, and we count along. So I'll point at this guy, and he'll say, and so on around the group, and you remember what number you are. That's the team you're in. It takes about 30 seconds. And it means that you... it's my hands. So, yeah, that's what we do. We try and mix people up, basically. You don't know who you're going to be coding with. Sometimes there are problems with that, though, because if by chance you have a group that's full of relatively inexperienced developers, it's the cat herder's responsibility to go, okay, well, let's just take one person out of this group. It's like being back at primary school again, when you were asked to all get into groups and you all went with your buddies and the teacher knew, actually, this group of boys, they're going to be a right problem, so I'm going to split them up. It's that sort of a thing. The teacher's going to say, okay, go move over to this one or that one. So, that's another responsibility for the cat herder.
I have a question.
Okay.
Which dojo will run this evening? Which type?
It'll have to be... okay, so here's what I'm thinking of doing. The point about the dojo is that it kind of self-organizes. But what I was thinking was attempting a group dojo. So I was going to ask you to form yourselves into groups, and I was going to give you a problem. I'm not going to tell you what it is, although I've actually mentioned it while I was doing my talk, because I don't want you to prepare for it. I want you to actually try and think of the solution while you're in the dojo and collaborate and talk around the problem with each other, because there's nothing worse than somebody turning up and going, "Oh, I did this yesterday. Look, here it is," and then you've got a group that's just that's twiddling their thumbs. Okay, so tonight what I'm going to do is say something like, "Okay, we have, I don't know, I think 60 is the maximum number in that room. So we have 60 developers. I'm going to ask you to get into groups of 5, and then I'm going to ask you to solve a particular problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem as well. Then I'm going to give you an hour to do it in, and then at the end, rather than getting every group to do a show and tell, I'm going to ask groups to volunteer themselves to show and tell, and limit that number to, say, 4 or 5 groups, so that we're not there until sort of 3 o'clock in the morning looking at shonky Python code that's been hacked together in an hour. So that's my idea at the moment, but it might change. Who knows?
I guess there are no other questions, so thank you very much once again.
See you at 8 o'clock.